Hello, everyone, and welcome to this video of the Paris Institute for Advanced Study. Today, we are very, very pleased to have with us Mykola, who's a fellow at the Institute, Mykola Riabchuk, whom I'm going to present in a few seconds. Thank you, Mykola, for agreeing to provide your analysis on this very complicated Ukraine never-ending, should I say, crisis. It's a very timely topic. We could say a burning issue. It's a complex topic, entangled, and it's very interesting to have a real specialist of this question with a longue durée, long-term view of this situation in Ukraine, a view on the history of its relations with the West and with Russia. So your talk today, if I'm correct, will be to call a spade, or how to make sense of the Ukraine crisis, origins, interpretations, and possible consequences. So, Mykola, you're this year a fellow at the Paris Institute for Advanced Study. You're also a senior research fellow in the Institute of Political and Nationalities Studies of the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine and a lecturer at the University of Warsaw. Among your recent publications, we can mention Eastern Europe since 1989, between the loosened authoritarianism and unconsolidated democracy, which was published in 2020. So Mykola, once again, thank you for being here. And I'm now going to introduce your discussants. First, let me introduce Françoise Thom. Françoise, you're an emerita maître de conférence HDR in contemporary history at Sorbonne University. You're a specialist of Russia, and among your recent publications, we can mention Comprendre le Poutinisme at Desclés de Brouwer in 2018, but also La marche à rebours, regard sur l'histoire soviétique et russe at the presses of Sorbonne University in 2021, so it's very recent. And last but not least, we have with us the pleasure to welcome Philippe Delara, who is an emeritus maître de conférence in political science at Université Paris II Panthéon-Assas. He teaches political philosophy and theory and the philosophy of law as well, and works on exiting totalitarianism. Philippe, you have published several articles on Ukraine, including Nous pouvons perdre l'Ukraine and L'Ukraine, l'Europe et la mémoire de la Shoah in the revue Commentaire. And so thank you both for being present to discuss and comment Mykola's presentation. And without further ado, Mykola, I'm giving you the floor.
Thank you very much for this introduction and for inviting me, for giving this opportunity, but also for inviting two other prominent scholars who would discuss the topic. Personally, I'm not very happy with this formula, Ukraine crisis, because somehow it implies that it's not just Ukraine crisis, it's Ukrainian crisis, which is not, of course. Ukraine did not originate this crisis. It was external, it was Russia-baked and imposed upon Ukraine, and now, as we see, it spread all around Europe, threatening international security and I would say global peace and global order. There are at least two questions which are related to Ukraine crisis. I emphasize not Ukrainian, but Ukraine crisis. In this formula we can accept as long as we understand it as crowds around Ukraine, not in Ukraine, but around Ukraine. So there are two questions which are related, could be raised vis-a-vis this crisis. First of all, what is the essence of it? What are fundamental reasons for this crisis? And a more specific question, why this crisis escalated right now, or not right now, 2 months ago, after 8 years of relative, not peace, but armistice, I would say, because since 2014 we have this low-intensity war, which is not prominently featured in international mass media, but every day we Ukrainians, every day we read about some people killed or wounded at the front line because of snipers, because of random shooting, because of minefields and so on. So it's not real peace, but it's more or less relative peace. Now we have escalation, we have real threat of invasion, and international media are full of this apocalyptic news, apocalyptic forecast. The second question is a bit easier. Why now? Why it escalated now? There are many circumstantial reasons for this. I believe that first of all, of course, the most important, I believe, is near completion of the Nord Stream 2, which gives Russia free hand to escalate, to invade, because it does not depend any longer on export of oil through Ukraine. But also there are some other minor reasons like winter, like energy crisis, like election in France, post-election in Germany, Olympic Games in China, and of course defeat of America and NATO in Afghanistan, and this, very rather shameful escape, which probably also encouraged Moscow regime to take advantage of this circumstance. So there are many minor reasons, but the deep reason, the profound reason for this conflict, for this so-called crisis, of course, is fundamental incompatibility of Russia and Ukraine. So if we take a look at how Russia perceives Ukraine, Russian view of Ukraine, and how Ukraine perceives itself, we would find out that these two visions are absolutely incompatible. For Russia, Ukraine had never been a subject, had never been an entity. Russia still lives in a kind of parallel world, in invented version of history, and within this model of history, within this worldview, there is no place for Ukraine in the past, and there is no place for Ukraine, no legitimacy for Ukraine in present. Ukraine is still considered as some, split territory which should be brought back to Russian fold by all possible means, by hook and crook. So, of course, this is unacceptable for Ukraine. Ukrainians try to escape as far and as fast as possible from this threat. Ukraine's Western orientation is not something new. It's not something that emerged after Euromaidan, as many people believe, and media very often promotes this idea that Euromaidan changed everything and Ukraine began integration into EU and NATO. It's not true. Ukraine declared its desire to join Euro-Atlantic structures since independence. Of course, it pursued this way very slowly, very carefully, not in order not to irritate Russia. So Ukraine's international policy was rather ambivalent. Ukraine still tried to maintain good relations with Russia, but at the same time to move towards NATO, and specifically towards the EU, because of soft power of the European Union. So I would say that historically we can claim Ukraine's orientation since 19th century is very emergence of Ukrainian nationalism, but institutionalized, this orientation institutionalized only, of course, after independence. It could be institutionalized earlier. But I'd like to remind you that it was Ukrainian post-Soviet President Leonid Kuchma who signed in the late 90s decree about Ukraine's strategic goal to join the European Union. Leonid Kuchma signed decree, Ukrainian parliament passed this decree in the early 2000s to declaring Ukraine's goal to join NATO. By the way, Prime Minister at the time was Viktor Yanukovych, who is believed to be very pro-Russian president, which was not. He was also very ambivalent in this regard, and it was he who actually promoted association agreement with the EU and gave it up only after it was forced, blackmailed by Moscow. So it's not so simple. Ukraine all the time was Western oriented, but a level of this commitment was different for many reasons. Since 2014, of course, Ukraine had no choice but to pursue this strategy very, very forcefully. And I believe that this may be the main reason for Russian escalation today. Why now? My answer is that Russia, Putin in particular, observes, he views, he notices that Ukraine's westernizations becomes increasingly irreversible. 2014 was a very significant mark because Ukraine gave up this ambiguity. Ukraine began its process of Westernization very, very forcefully. But I believe that also very important was the year 2019, when there were free and fair presidential elections in Ukraine, when the so-called nationalist president was replaced by another, by his political rival, by the challenger, but it did not impact Ukrainian policy, international policy. Ukraine still pursues Western, pro-Western politics, which means that, there is a sort of consensus in Ukrainian society, among Ukrainian elites about Western orientation. They may quarrel among themselves, they may discuss, they may persecute each other even sometimes, we know such cases. But generally there is consensus, and as long as Ukraine as democracy, any politician in Ukraine have to listen to the people and to pursue politics which coincide with people's desire, or otherwise to persuade people that they are wrong and we have a better policy. So far, these desires of the elite and of population at large coincide. We have a general consensus vis-a-vis joining the European Union in Ukraine. What changed after 2014? Ukrainians changed their mind about NATO. Before 2014, before Russian invasion in 2014, Ukrainians were rather reluctant because they understood that this was a very sensitive issue for Moscow, and they did not want to provoke Moscow. So European Union was okay, it was purely economic union, so everybody supported it. Ukrainians were positive all the time about the EU, but NATO was a more controversial issue. In 2014, they came to understand that, for Moscow, it doesn't matter whether it's economic or not. European Union was as irritating for Moscow as NATO, so there was no thanks to avoid, to abstain from this movement. Moreover, Ukraine, I'd like to emphasize, because many people don't know this, that Ukraine, under Yanukovych in 2014, Ukraine passed the law which declared de facto neutral status. Ukraine declared itself non-aligned country, again, in order to avoid any Russian pressure, because Ukraine had strategic goal to sign this economic agreement, association agreement with the EU. It was more important, of course, economic advancement. It didn't help. This neutral status, because some experts today say that, well, probably one possible solution for Ukraine conflict is to Finlandize Ukraine, to declare it neutral. It was neutral, actually. So what? It lost Crimea, it lost part of Donbass, and still have this low-intensity war and Russian escalation. Neutrality did not work. So so far my preliminary conclusion is that interest of Ukraine and Russia incompatible. Mutual understanding or misunderstanding is absolutely incompatible. And so the only way for Ukraine is to reform, to become stronger, and to be careful, to defend itself by all possible means from external enemy. And what the international community should do in this situation, I guess my colleagues would imply better than myself, even though I have also some recipes in this regard. So I'll stop here for a while.
Philippe, Françoise, do you want to comment on what Mykola has just said?
I would like to mention two facts. First, briefly, to confirm that the NATO option was completely ruled out during the Maidan. When I spoke to Ukrainian friends at that time, they said, don't tell the word NATO. Mm-hmm. And things have changed very rapidly in recent years. Since, if I'm correct, 70% of Ukrainian, according to a poll, are favorable to Ukraine entering NATO. And second fact, less known, I think, it is that for a rather long time, even before the Euromaidan, there were contacts between the NATO military and Ukrainian army to promote a growing alignment of Ukraine army on NATO's standards. I mean technical standards. So to make more easy and efficient a collaboration, a military collaboration in the future. And to my knowledge, these contacts, which are not well known but non-secret at all. There are papers in specialized literature on these operations, their successes and failure, etc. It's a strong dimension of the Western orientation of Ukraine since independence, as Mykola rightly said, and not only since Euromaidan.
Thank you. Françoise?
I have just 2 points to make about the question of why escalation no. Why this escalation no? I think the Afghan factor is very important because the Russian, Putin thought that why not, he thought in his way that Ukraine is an anti-Russia. Why not turn Ukraine into an anti-NATO instrument? And that was his idea when a lever against, to use Ukraine as a lever against NATO. His idea was to threaten Ukraine, to blackmail the West about Ukraine, and in order to get his what he called the security guarantees, which amounted to a liquidation of NATO in Europe. So the idea of Putin, when he saw that the American fled Afghanistan so easily, he thought that they would flee Europe probably as easily as they had left Kabul, and he thought it would need only a little push to get them out of Europe. And the main idea of Putin was this one: to use Ukraine as a lever to obtain the liquidation of NATO. And in his mind, it was very, very easy to. I read in the Russian press, the Kremlin ideologues were convinced that it would be very easy to obtain, that Russia, after leaving Kabul, they would leave Kiev and the rest of Europe. So you have to think of the whole crisis as not only Ukraine, not only about Ukraine, it's about the future of NATO. It was about the future of NATO and American presence in Europe. The Russians wanted to obtain American-free Europe, factually. That was the content of their ultimatum in December. So it's much more than the Ukrainian question. But this was, it did not work as expected in the Kremlin. That's another question.
Well, it was probably Angela Merkel who mentioned long ago that Putin lives in parallel reality, and unfortunately it's true. But there is a bigger problem than that, because if he only used some fake news and propaganda to fool international community and to fool part of Ukrainians, it would be not okay, but it's bearable because we can counteract something, we can oppose information, real information, facts, and so on. But the problem is that, Russian elite tends to believe itself in what they are saying. And this leads to a lot of miscalculations and missteps. And I believe that, the very invasion in Ukraine in 2014 was largely caused by their own myth about Ukrainians as the same people as Russia. They probably sincerely believe that Ukrainians are like Russians. They are waiting for a kind of liberation because all of them or most of them speak Russian. I speak Russian myself. It's language I'm fluent. All this 90% of Ukrainians who speak Russian, they are waiting with flowers for Russians who are coming.
That's what they say every day on Russian television. You can hear that
they
the
still believe,
Ukrainians
yes.
are waiting for liberation.
Yes, but it was, I believe it was a huge surprise for them to encounter this resistance. When in 2014 the Ukrainians met them not with flowers but with bullets, I believe that many were surprised. I remember a desperate writing of Alexander Dugin, Putin's main geopolitician, who wrote in Facebook that I can't believe these are Ukrainians. I know Ukrainians, they are wonderful Slavonic people, and this is race of bastards who emerged from sewer manholes. So he was absolutely shocked by resistance. He wrote that we should clean Ukraine from these idiots. The genocide of these cretins is due and inevitable, that quotation. I'm sorry for quoting these dirty words, but this is how a substantial part of Russian elite thinks, and they believe it. They divide Ukrainians for good Ukrainians, right Ukrainians, and bad Ukrainians, wrong Ukrainians. Good Ukrainians are like us, Ukrainians who recognize that they are Russians, and they, of course, should be promoted because they are just, kind of Russians. But bad Ukrainians, wrong Ukrainians should be exterminated because they don't suit this model of wonderful Slavonic people. And this majority of Ukraine's population, 90% of Ukrainians declare themselves patriots of Ukraine, 90% of them support Ukraine independence. So what to do with these wrong Ukrainians? How many right Ukrainians would live after Russian invasion? Of course, it makes Ukrainian choice very simple. Ukraine has no choice. Ukraine has just to resist by all possible means, whether the West would support or not. Luckily, in 8 years, yes, 8 years that passed, Western politicians came more or less to understand the essence of the regime. Because I feel that in 2014, they didn't have this understanding. They didn't have this understanding earlier in 2008, for example, when invasion in Georgia passed absolutely unpunished, unnoticed virtually, and this encouraged Mr. Putin. There are many other things which were committed by that regime since very beginning, which were tolerated. The West preferred to close eyes, not to notice all these missteps, starting from very strange blows up of building in Moscow, apartments, when Putin was going to power in 1999. Which was still not investigated, and nobody noticed this. And there are many other things which were absolutely tolerated and silenced, and Putin was rewarded with Legion Honoraire, and he was rewarded with standing ovation in Bundestag, and so on. So, of course, this guy has naturally came to believe that, Westerners are idiots. They can swallow up whatever I do. He employs blackmail, he employs bullying, he employs bluff, and he, of course, employs bribery. This four powerful B, which are instrumental. And he's successful, at least until recently he was successful. It had to pass 8 years of subversive actions, poisoning of political opponents, interference in Western elections, and so on, before Western politicians began more or less to think, well, maybe it's not so great. Maybe this, idea of dialogue with rogue regime is not wonderful. Maybe it doesn't lead to anywhere because he's cheating us. He's not serious, absolutely. You remember his ultimatum to NATO. It was ridiculous. It was just, insult. It was It was not a document for negotiation. It was just in order to humiliate Western partners. So how can you negotiate with this regime? How can you? I understand it's an important country. It's a country with nuclear arms, but again, as long as it has nuclear arms, we should not take at face value this talks about security concerns. What kind of security concerns may have a country which has a second nuclear arsenal in the globe? Who threatens Russia? Ukraine threatens Georgia, Estonia, or NATO, which probably is the last thing which NATO wants to fight. Yeah? So, of course, first of all, we should reject all these narratives. We should not accept these talks about security concerns, because as soon as Western politicians begin to repeat this phrase, this phraseology, they lose. They accept this framework which is established by Moscow. And so my first advice to Western colleagues is don't buy this phraseology. Don't take this rhetoric. It's absolutely false, subversive rhetoric which undermines your discursive power.
I have another remark still. It's about the neutral status. We see very often now in the press that if Ukraine would be neutral, it would be acceptable for Russia. And this is it's a total illusion in the West, because Russia would never allow Ukraine to have its own domestic policy. It would impose, it wants to impose on Ukraine Russian historiography, Russian media, and so on and so on. It's absolutely utopic to think that they would accept neutral Ukraine like Finland or like any like Switzerland or something like that. It's for Russia, the conflict about Ukraine is a conflict of civilization. And it's a conflict between the West and what they call the their Eurasian civilization. So it's the main aim of Putin is to pull Ukraine in this Eurasian bloc, and that means to accept all the mythology of Russia and propaganda of Russia and the political system of Russia with a dictatorship and the bogus election and so on. So it's purely utopic to think that Russia would accept a neutral Ukraine. It means you don't understand Russia if you think that.
And I would like to add another dimension which makes the situation even worse for Russia. It's the point where the virtual world of Putin and the real world come in touch. It's the fact that democracy in progress in Ukraine is a deadly threat for Russia, precisely because they think, and a lot of Russians think that Ukraine is after all Russia. If Ukraine goes better and goes more democratic, democratic unlike Russia, this would be a deadly threat for the Russian regime. And it's another issue, I would say, in the real world rather than in the virtual one, which makes the Ukrainian question not negotiable with Russia. And I would like to come back to another point by Mykola about the evolution of Western leaders about Russia. I think there has been a step-by-step, clumsy and too slow, but definite better understanding on what is Russia and how to deal with them. We started with the illusion that Russia, post-Soviet Russia, was a flawed Western state. And now a lot of leaders in European governments, I think, genuinely understand that Russia is a rogue state. Among them, I would like to mention the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Le Drian, who had a very telling metaphor. He said that Russia is an unbearable neighbor. We can do nothing with him. He's boring us, disturbing us on many ways. But since he lives in the flat, we cannot ignore him. And so we can find a way to deal with it. And it's roughly the metaphor of what we used to call during the Cold War containment. And I think that maybe I'm too optimistic, but I have a feeling that Western leaders, including in Germany and in France, are coming to the idea that the Russian problem calls for containment and nothing else.
And not among the right-wing politicians in France. There is some way to go.
Nicola, you mentioned bribery and influence. The Russian party in for the country I know, in Italy, Germany, and France is extremely powerful, not only at the far right and far left, but also in moderate right politicians. Even the most of the pro-Russian politicians are people reluctant to EU, and so one can think that there is some ideological coherence. But when you cannot explain things this way, but must suggest things like bribery and otherwise, it's when politicians openly pro-European are at the same time strong supporter of Putin's regime. Maybe let me quote Mr. Lagarde, the leader of the UDI, a small center party allied with the main center-right party, Les Républicains, or a former minister and philosopher, Luc Ferry, who is by no way a conservative, anti-liberal economics, etc. Man, and nevertheless is a very faithful support of Putin, and he repeats the Russian elements of language whenever he can.
Mykola?
I feel that, you know, as long as there is opportunity for Western politicians to occupy top position in the board of Gazprom or Rosneft with $500,000 salary a year, it's tempting. It's huge temptation, and we know about such scandals. Where there was a very huge scandal in Austria when government ruling party fell down because of attempt to bribe them from the Russian side and so on. So yes, it's problem, but I don't think it's insurmountable problem. My preliminary conclusion is that, of course, Russia can be contained and should be contained and should be called what it is. A rogue state is a rogue state. I don't agree with those who say that, you know, sanctions do not work. Of course, if they are incoherent and too weak, they don't work. But if they are really powerful, if they are really strong, of course, Russia step back. And we see this, that Russia doesn't dare to invade as long as it understands that sanctions are possible, and these sanctions would affect everybody, and primarily the Russian elite. I just want to remind you that Russia is not North Korea and Russia is not Iran. Russian elite keeps all their money and property in the West. They are accustomed to spend dolce vita in the West. They have their children, their wives, their mistresses in the West. So they don't want to lose this contact. They don't want to lose this luxury. They need it. And of course, if they feel that their property, their dolce vita in the West is threatened, they step back. They wouldn't invade. This is, of course, it's a very ambivalent argument, but I understand that there is no real threat as long as they have their investments in Switzerland, in Côte d'Azur, and so on. So please remember this and don't hesitate to keep them on the hook and to sanction wherever possible very, very harshly. And of course, I believe that Ukraine needs support, not only diplomatic, not only political, but also not only military, which is also important because Ukraine has to defend, Russia has to understand that Ukraine is able to defend itself without any NATO troops and whatever. But also Ukraine, of course, need to be reformed. So they need very strong pressure, also pressure on the Ukrainian government to introduce some anti-corruption reforms and so on, because of course weak Ukraine is vulnerable. Weak Ukraine is very eager, easy target for Moscow, and we have to remind this to Ukrainian government, to Ukrainian politicians that, of course we are ready to help you, but please help yourself. Please do your homework. This is also very important. But still, so far as we see from this pending conflict, it's not as apocalyptic as it could be. We know that also from past experience that Russia backtrack when it encounters resistance. They pretend to be crazy, but they are not crazy. They are very calculated people. They know how far they could go. They try to push red lines. They check red lines, but they don't overstep them. They are really very, very smart. So please be also smart.
Yes, I'd like to say that for that matter, Putin's Russia is not USSR. Is both more adventurous and more comment on dit, poule mouillée,
cowardly.
No courage.
Cowardly.
Cowardly. Voilà, is more coward. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there is something puzzling, which is the persistence of the Soviet-Russian lie type, which is something very difficult to understand and to describe. On this subject, I am just the pupil of Françoise and of our master Alain Besançon, who tried to coin very precisely the nature of, at that time, Soviet lie, which is something different from propaganda or bullshit speech. It's something very different because it's not aimed at being believed by the victim, but to disorient the victim. And I'm afraid that in the current situation and with the new channels like social media, etc., the machine of the Soviet-Russian lie is still living and very, very powerful. What we call a propaganda war or a media war, I'd like to coin it rather as a cognitive war. And although I am confident in the outcome of this crisis, in that I think that Russia can't afford even partial attack against Ukraine, I am not so optimistic on the ability of Russia to metabolize their step back, their failure on the ground, into a new narrative about good Russian against bad Americans, etc. And so the battle of words is as important as the battle of weapons in the current crisis.
Perhaps you want to say a few things about how you see the situation, the crisis unfold in the next days and weeks?
I believe that it will subside. I think that Russia overestimated its discursive power. It's overestimated Western readiness to step back, to subdue to Russian demands. Russia bluffed and failed with this bluff, so probably now they are looking for some excuse to step back. It's not so easy, of course. They have to save their face. They cannot go completely empty-handed, so they have to invent something, and we can expect some minor provocations. But the main goal of Russia, please remember, is one of main goals is to avoid serious sanctions. So they are interested, even if they do something wrong, something bad, they still remember about plausible deniability. They need to be able to deny that it's not me, it's not we, it's some, miners and tractor drivers in Donbass who used rockets and tanks to crash Ukrainian army. But it's not us, it's not we. So they need this plausible deniability, and they would imitate it as much as possible. Of course, we cannot exclude also some provocation and sending some peacekeepers into Donbass, but it's more serious because I don't think that today anybody would believe in the seriousness of this, peacekeeping operation. So it's not so simple that probably it would result in sanctions. So I think that they would step back. How they find, what way they found out, because they have to find some way back. But they are looking for this way out from the situation. They miscalculated. They expected to blackmail the West. They expected to achieve something. They expected to isolate Ukraine because it's allegedly not so important for the West, especially for America. America is preoccupied with China and so on. They miscalculated. So now they are looking for the retreat. How to save the face.
But in this context, they still have, I'd like to say, a nuclear defeat device, which a way to turn the defeat into victory. It's Minsk agreements, because Europeans were and are committed to the so-called Minsk agreement, with the so-called Normandy format. And there is always the temptation, even with awareness of what Russia is, to say, let's implement Minsk agreements, all Minsk agreements, nothing but Minsk agreements as a solution. But now this policy is in fact would be the first step of the destruction of Ukraine, notably with the question of the pretense of decentralization of Ukraine, making Ukraine into a federal state, etc. and this scenario should be ruled out.
If I may, just very short remark about the Minsk agreement. First of all, it's not agreement, it's accords. Minsk accords, technically speaking. I read the text. Text is very vague, very convoluted and incoherent, and allows very different interpretations. So Moscow has its own interpretation, Kiev has its own interpretation, but these interpretations are very different, and it's difficult to really to agree on something. The text is really very unclear. But at least there are first steps which should be done. There are 3 security steps which should be done. And Moscow does not want to do this. You know, Moscow never implemented these first 3 steps about security. So we cannot negotiate the rest. But of course, the goal of Moscow is clear: to transform Ukraine is absolutely dysfunctional state, something kind of bigger Bosnia. You know what Bosnia is, and they want to make Ukraine a much bigger dysfunctional state, controlled by Moscow, not by the West, as Bosnia is more or less guided, but by Moscow. So of course it's unacceptable for Ukraine. Everybody knows this, everybody understands this, and Ukraine would rather give up Donbass than would accept Donbass on Moscow conditions. We have to understand it very clear. So Ukraine would rather survive without these regions than would be poisoned, would perish with this Moscow ruled, Moscow manipulated region. So it's absolutely clear, and it's non-negotiable. So please remember this, and all the attempts to force Ukraine to accept Moscow interpretation of Donbass agreement are futile, because it never would happen. Ukraine would rather give up Donbass completely than accept it.
I have heard that Biden is now exerting pressure on Zelensky to implement the Minsk Accords, as you say. In which interpretation is he specific on American interpretation of the Minsk Accords, or does he accept the Russian interpretation? I think this evolution is quite worrying. If the West is not absolutely clear about what is the underlying aims of the Minsk agreements, use it. And that's why what I am really worrying now, I think the Russians, they could not realize their maximum program with their ultimatum, but they still, and usually that's how they act, when they don't realize their biggest aims, they try to gain on a minor field, a less important field, and if they gain on the Minsk agreements, then it's quite a victory for Russia.
Yes, I agree. We should be careful. Yeah, I agree.
Dear colleagues, we've reached the end of the time we have. Do you want to have a few words of conclusion, perhaps, Mykola?
No, I made conclusion already that I expect de-escalation in Donbass in the short period. Russia will probably find some way to de-escalate, to find how to do this. But I don't expect any solution for this conflict, because it's fundamental, it's historically determined, it's identity-driven. So as long as we have this, rogue regime in Moscow, we should expect new provocations, new pressure, new blackmail, and so on. We have to be ready. We have to be prepared.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mykola Riabchuk. Thank you, Françoise Thom, and thank you, Philippe Delara, for being with us and clarifying the situation a little bit for all of us. Thanks a lot.